thank you for inviting me to this very interesting and worthwhile conference. I hope that it flourishes in the future. Before I read my paper in the old-fashioned way, let me just make a couple of self-centered comments relating to the theme of this conference and, well, me as self-centered. You know, I studied psychology as an undergraduate at the University of Manchester, and then the philosophy I studied at that time was mainly phenomenology and existentialism, so I knew about Husserl and Sartre, and my first publication actually was on Husserl when I was actually 22. It was my undergraduate dissertation. And then I went to Oxford as a graduate student, and of course it was very important for me then to, let's use the word conform, to fit in with the way philosophy was conducted at Oxford in the early 1970s. That was when I was a student there. And so I did, and I was specialised in philosophy of language and philosophical logic and those kinds of things. With nothing, I didn't talk about the mind at all. I was in flight from the mind because I was a psychology student. I was getting away from that. And I started teaching, and then years went by, and I was initially still working on these more abstruse, very analytical subjects, actually, and then gradually I moved towards philosophy of mind a little bit. But I think you would have described me then as a pretty narrow analytic philosopher. But then in subsequent years, for various reasons, I took up other issues. I suppose the main one was when I started teaching philosophy and literature, when I was already in the States, and I wrote a book, Ethics, Evil and Fiction, which was about how ethics could be enriched by conjoining it with the study of literature. So that was my first humane philosophy venture, we might say, which was clearly a case of it. And then, having, I suppose, done that, then the floodgates were opened, and then, I wrote about film and then also about Shakespeare, actually in semi-popular books. And even later than that, I wrote a book about philosophy and sport. Gave a seminar on philosophy and sport at a university with students. And anybody who talks to me for more than 5 minutes knows that I start talking about sport at the least provocation. And I don't really myself see a great distinction between sport and philosophy at a certain level. In this, of course, I follow Plato, and what could be better than following Plato, who advocated, of course, the joint study of gymnastics, as it was called then, and philosophy. So I have an interest in that, but I think a lot of people would tend to think of me, I think, as perhaps a somewhat dry analytic philosopher, independently of those interests. When I was a student at Manchester, the head of department was a man called Professor John Cohen, and he wrote a book called Humanistic Psychology. And he wrote that book because he felt that psychology as it was then practiced was misguided, wasn't sufficiently humanistic, obviously. It was, based at that time, that was the end of behaviorism, and the study of rats and Skinnerian psychology was still somewhat dominant. And so I read Humanistic Psychology when I was an undergraduate and agreed with it. It raises a purely linguistic question, of course, of the way the organisers of this movement, we might say, call it humane philosophy, not humanistic philosophy. On the face of it, of course, humane means kindly. Maybe that was an intended ambiguity. Philosophy, more kind and gentle philosophy, which is a fine motive. But, of course, I think part of the meaning is humanistic philosophy. Right? That's good too. I mean, that's the usual use of that. So, the paper I'm going to read to you is a paper in Humanistic Psychology, also humane philosophy or humanistic philosophy, and it really is an attempt to integrate what we might call a scientific approach to the mind with what we might call a more humanistic approach to the mind, and I'll try to indicate, if it's not obvious to you, where I think we're going in the direction of a humanistic psychology or a humanistic philosophy. I will describe this modestly as a double paradigm shift. Not just a shift in philosophy, but a shift in psychology as well. So in this next 40 minutes or so, we will now in this room witness a double paradigm shift. So, here we go. Sketch for a General Theory of Human Psychology. It's actually based on, the title is based on Sartre's Sketch for a Theory of the Human Emotions, or Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions, I think it's called. I could have called it Towards a Sketch for a General Theory of Human Psychology, or An Outline of a Sketch. It would be equally adequate, as you'll see why I say this. Is it possible to come up with highly general organizational principles of human psychology? The task has been attempted before, as with associationist psychology, classical conditioning theory, and recently computationalism. The idea is to discover general principles that cover a wide range of psychological phenomena, thus unifying what appears disparate. In this paper, I make another attempt at this project by integrating what we have learned since Chomsky introduced his theoretical framework, also adding some emphases that may be less familiar. I will be operating at a high level of abstraction. I shall consider 4 types of competence, Chomskyan word, of course: linguistic, logical, geometrical, and social. By linguistic competence, I mean simply the ability to produce and comprehend grammatical sentences of one's native language, or the cognitive structure that underlies that ability. By logical competence, I mean the ability to reason logically, that is, according to valid rules of inference, to follow trains of reasoning produced by others, and to produce such trains oneself. By geometrical competence, I mean the ability to classify and manipulate geometrical forms, to tell triangles from squares, to grasp geometrical relations, to master school geometry upon suitable instruction. By social competence, I mean the ability to grasp social relationships and dynamics, to read the minds of others, to understand social groupings, family, village, nation. No doubt, these competences break down into sub-competences with a good deal of inner complexity. Thus we have phonetic, syntactic, and semantic competence. We have competence in deductive and inductive logic, in modal or deontic logic, and so on. Geometric competence can include basic sensory motor tasks, such as sorting objects according to shape, as well as theoretical grasp of abstract geometry. Social competence will involve a whole host of abilities employed in social interactions, predicting the behavior of others, and moral evaluation. For example, knowing what a promise is and that breaking promises is blameworthy. In these 4 competences, we see huge areas of the human mind at work with enormous sophistication and complexity, almost daunting sophistication and complexity. So if we can discern some general features of the operative systems, we will have discovered something very general about the mind. My question is going to be whether we can unify these 4 competences, which of course seem very disparate, by articulating general organizational principles, thus providing a synoptic picture of what is distinctive to the human mind. More broadly, I want to know what the mind must be such that it is capable of the competences in question, that is, its most general properties. A number of questions can be asked about these 4 competences, as follows. What are the universal features of each competence? I.e., what features do all humans share that possess such competences? That's a very recognisable Chomskyan question, usually about linguistic universals. What are the linguistic universals? In one case, what are the logical universals, or the geometric universals, or the social universals, if any? And then, what are the specific principles involved in each competence? Presumably they're not the same principles involved in each of them. What do they have in common, these different principles, if anything? That's the main question I'm interested in this paper. How are these competences expressed in action, what Chomsky would call performance? To what extent are the underlying principles innate? Another Chomskyan question. What does the schedule of acquisition look like in the child? How did the competences evolve in the course of human evolution? Are any of them more basic than the others? Might any derive from the antecedent presence of the others? As one of these 4 competences, somehow the primary one and the others evolved from that? How do they interact with each other? How are they realized in the brain? What are their characteristic pathologies? To what extent are the operative principles conscious? In each of these cases, we think of each competence as psychologically real, and we ask questions about their internal structure, their origins, their interactions, their physical realization, their overt expression in behavior, how basic each is, and so on. That's what a good psychology would look like according to my view of human psychology. It would ask all those questions proceeding in the right way. We try to do justice to their distinctive properties so that our model of each competence is not impoverished or distorted. Again, a very Chomskyan recommendation. We take them for what they are instead of trying to shoehorn them into a preconceived theoretical box, as it might be, trying to show that all verbal behaviour is operant conditioning. What I now propose to do is to list the most general features the four competences have in common. Many of these, I think, will be quite familiar, though my interpretation of them may not be. I'm looking for universals across these domains, not within them. So not the same as Chomsky's question. The mind then will be characterized as the system that has these intercompetence universals. That is, there are abstract principles that are given specialized form in each specific competence. There is an abstract operational schematism, as psychologists say, that gets exemplified in linguistic, logical, geometric, and social competence. Let me emphasize, I'm offering only a sketch here, with little detail. The first goes by several names: generative, recursive, combinatorial, compositional, creative, infinite. The point is usually applied to linguistic competence. In language, we can produce a potential infinity of sentences based on combinations of primitive parts. Sentences have structure, and our mastery of language reflects this structure. But the basic point, same basic point, applies to the other three competences. Logical arguments also have structure, and our grasp of them is a projection from mastery of more primitive modes of inference. A complex chain of reasoning is a composite of smaller bits of reasoning. Also, we grasp abstract rules of inference that apply to infinitely many potential cases. That's what you learn about when you learn elementary logic. Grammatical rules generate well-formed sentences. Logical rules generate valid arguments, which are relations between propositions. In geometry, we have figures composed of primitive parts, of course, lines, planes, and solids. An infinity of figures can be produced by iteration of basic geometric components. We generate a grasp of these principles of combination in our ability to build things using objects of certain shapes, as with basic building block operations. Architecture is, of course, a more sophisticated expression of our underlying geometrical competence. In social cognition, we grasp social units as combinations of simpler elements, people and other animals. Thus we grasp the concepts of family, friend, village, pack, herd, marriage, nation, and so on. Kind of thing discussed by John Searle. We understand how individuals combine with others to form certain kinds of social unit and what the principles are that underlie that. We also understand social relations, such as promising, contracting, befriending, lying, cheating, and so on. Our grasp of morality is part of this, which is about right and wrong in social relations. We function as we do socially only because we have this kind of social cognition. It's customary to express this point by saying that we can analyze complex structures into parts. The wholes are not taken as primitive. I would add that we're also capable of synthesis as we fuse the elements into wholes. In reception, say of speech, we analyze. In production, we synthesize. We grasp the basic units as elements of a potential synthesis, whether they are words, propositions, shapes, or individuals. So we see the parts in relation to each other and to constructed wholes. We see the elements according to their roles, what they do in relation to other elements. So it's like this: if X were combined with Y, we would get Z. Very general things for X, Y, and Z there. Words combine into sentences, propositions combine into arguments, shapes combine into geometric structures, and people combine into social formations. In each case, the competence involves grasp of a part-whole structure, where wholes can in turn become parts, and so on indefinitely, what is sometimes called recursion. This abstract principle is therefore Universal to the four competences, it is the general idea of generativity. The second feature I shall call segmentation. By this I mean that the mind conceives the elements of a combination as discrete entities sharply distinguished from other entities. Thus, we conceive of words as clearly individuated, as genuine units with their own identity, and similarly for proposition shapes and individuals. We do not regard these elements as intrinsically fuzzy or continuous with other elements. It is well known that the acoustic signals of speech are far less well defined than what we hear when we listen to speech, which are far more continuous than heard speech, as is revealed in what's called a speech spectrograph. Yet we experience these signals as discrete units, so psycholinguists call that phonetic segmentation. We actively segment the stimulus. Much the same is true of the visual stimulus. Again, we segment the ambient array into sharply defined objects. Thus we impose a segmental structure onto the world. We insist on sharply demarcated units. No doubt this aids the mind-brain's combinatorial proclivities, for now we have nicely defined units with which to work. It isn't the world that foists the segments on us, rather we foist segments on the world, in order to facilitate our psychological operations. It would be all very unmanageable if we didn't segment. In any case, in each of our four domains, the mind works with a basic vocabulary, in inverted commas, of discrete elements, things that can operate as manageable segments of a larger whole. Thirdly, we have the notion of rule-governed principles of combination. Not just anything goes, you have to play by the rules. Words must be combined according to grammatical rules if the output is going to be successful. Here we encounter modal notions. You must combine words thus and so, and not just higgledy-piggledy. Similarly, you must infer conclusions from premises according to valid logical rules, not just any way you feel like, or somebody will say you're reasoning invalidly, and you don't want that. And there are geometrical rules too. You can only construct a triangle by combining lines in a certain way. You can only build a house by setting bricks of certain shapes one upon another. Breaking such rules produces monsters like Escher drawings and round squares. Thus we have the notion of geometrical necessity. It's much the same for the social arrangements. There are rules about what social formations are permissible, as with marriage or employment arrangements. Thus we get the idea of social obligations and social freedoms, what is required by social rules and what is not required by social rules. Deontological ethics is precisely a theory of social rules. Says things like, don't break your promises. To be sure, the rules are different in each of our four cases, but in each case we do have the idea of rule-governed combinations, those that obey the rules and those that don't. Putting this together with the first two features, we can say that the abstract schematism, which we're now trying to characterize, involves combining discretely segmented units into synthetic wholes according to precise rules of combination. We operate with rules in each of the four areas, and we recognize what constitutes obedience to a rule and what does not. The next feature is a corollary of the previous one. Each of our four domains incorporates a prescriptive or normative dimension, isn't it? And I'm getting closer now to questions which we might think of as humane or humanistic. That is, notions of right and wrong can be correctly applied to the domain. There is thus a right way and a wrong way to combine words, according to the grammatical rules. Nonsensical combinations of words are deemed bad, and you can be criticized for flouting the rules of grammar. That's the mark of the prescriptive. I don't mean here what is called prescriptivism about usage. I just mean basic rules of sentence formation. Split infinitives and dangling participles are fine, or maybe fine, I'm not taking a view about that. But it's bad to produce a string like barking it sing John Carvery. Right. You're not doing very well if that's what you come out with on a regular basis. You will be criticized if you do that. People say, what do you mean? Can you try again? I'm not understanding you. You are expected to mean something by what you say. Right? It is good to speak meaningfully. These are all truisms, aren't they? Good to speak. That's how we think about it. In the case of logic, prescriptivism is clearly right. You ought to reason logically, and illogical reasoning opens you up to warranted criticism. We use logic precisely in order to evaluate arguments. It's not descriptive, it's prescriptive. In geometry too, there is a right and a wrong way to draw an equilateral triangle, and as Plato observed, we have the idea of the perfect triangle, which no drawn triangle ever quite attains. Indeed, Plato's entire conception of geometry sees it as a repository of value, those perfect unchanging forms that elevate us in their very contemplation. In the case of social competence, we need look no further than ordinary morality, with its many prescriptions about conduct in relation to others. For instance, stealing is wrong. Obviously, morality is the domain of right and wrong. In each area, there we can say, there is thus a heavy infusion of value judgment, of a sense of rightness and wrongness, perfection and imperfection. It is not all value-neutral description, but is shot through with approval and disapproval, praise and blame and allied notions. And we act as we do because of these normative judgments, clearly in the case of morality, but no less so in the other cases. We try to draw the perfect triangle, clearly as we approximate that as well as we can. We make an effort to reason logically, and we are ashamed to make grammatical blunders, not that we often do, in the sense that I'm talking about, save in pathological cases such as aphasia. So none of us in this room has ever uttered a sentence like the one I quoted earlier about the car. Right? I'm not talking about boring grammatical blunders like splitting infinitives, and right? not the point. Okay. We are guided by the governing norms of the competence and respectful of their demands. We see things under normative conceptions. Here the human mind is saturated with notions of values, and it proceeds accordingly. Thus the rules are not experienced as arbitrary, but as conducive to genuine values, and I would say, following earlier talk, genuine, real, objective values. It is a good thing to speak grammatically, commendable to reason logically, admirable to make one's triangles as close to the ideal as possible, and right to act morally. Human psychology is steeped in evaluations of many kinds, though this is not something you would guess from typical behavioristic psychology or even computational psychology. I'll come back to this point. You don't see the textbooks talking about the idea of values as integral to psychology, do you? They talk about it as if it's all mechanical and all that. The four competences, as so far characterized, are quite abstract in their general mode of operation. They must be described in highly abstract language in order to bring out their commonalities. We were accustomed to the abstractness of grammatical rules, a point often made by Chomsky. He's always saying how abstract these rules are. And the abstract nature of logic is also well attested, as are the abstractness of geometry and of moral rules, or moral values, whatever you want to call them. But now we perceive a higher level of abstractness as we discern what these competences have in common. The idea of a process that is generative, segmental, rule-governed, and norm-guided. In principle, this very abstract structure could be implemented in many ways, as it is in the four competences considered here. The structure is neutral with respect to its more specific expressions. Maybe in Martians, the creation of art is subsumed by a system with this abstract character, which appears not to be the case for humans. It doesn't seem to be the case that our artistic abilities have this kind of the structure I'm describing. We might put it by saying they're genuinely creative or whatever. Maybe in other terrestrial species, so-called language does not fall under the general schematism that I'm sketching, say in the case of dolphins and bees. In fact, the point is often made about bees that their systems of so-called language are far more analog and ours are more digital. Digital is almost another word for segmental and so on. We might think of the schematism as a kind of supercompetence, an abstract structure that lies behind and makes possible the specific competences that we have discussed. Where this supercompetence came from in evolutionary history, and how it was specialized into the four specific competences, we don't know. But it is conceivable that it predates them and has some entirely other origin. As it might be, our ability to negotiate trees in our dim arboreal past, so our brains were adapted to that lifestyle there, and of course in trees we have structures, physical structures with a certain kind of form called trees, and we had to have a cognitive system to negotiate those physical things called trees, and of course now we have the idea of tree structures and branching and so forth, which I think was an abstraction from that. Or as another very speculative, I like this because I like the idea of human prehistory as essentially involving coming down from trees and what happened and after that. Or another example that came to me when I was watching a TV documentary about astronomy, apparently early man was detecting the constellations in the sky, as a very basic thing, and this was very important to navigation in, prehistorical life. So the ability to see patterns in the starry sky might be, since it's a very important ability, that who's to say, might be the basis for this abstract schematism, which was installed in the brain and then was co-adapted for language and the other things I'm talking about. These are all totally speculative ideas, but let's not rule them out. In any case, the deep architectural principles of the human mind seem extremely abstract, multiply adaptable schemas, not specific interpreted contents. Specific contents get slotted into the abstract schema, but it has a nature and psychological reality that transcends its particular exemplifications. Just as universal human grammar is abstract relative to particular human languages, so the general schematism is abstract relative to universal grammar. It's just an instance of something more abstract. Thus, the schematism can show up as the basis of various types of competence. That, at any rate, is the picture that is emerging. The four competences are no doubt themselves quite modular, as Chomsky would say, or Fodor, but it may be that they stem from something more universal, something with a higher level of abstractness. We can try to investigate the nature of this abstract schematism as such, formulating as best we can its general properties. The competences are all cognitive. This is the next point. This may seem like a triviality, but it's not. The word cognition refers specifically to knowledge, that concept, not mere belief or other mental representations. In each area, we know things to be so. We know that a given sentence is grammatical because we know the rules of grammar. We know that a certain inference is logically valid. We don't just conjecture that this is so. That would be quite the wrong way to describe it. Your view about the validity of modus ponens is not mere opinion. We know what a triangle is and that no perfect triangle has ever been drawn. A point with great significance for Plato, of course. We know that stealing is prima facie wrong. We don't just have merely a tentative opinion about it. So, in our sketch for general human psychology, we need to make it explicit that we are dealing with states of knowledge. The concept of knowledge becomes a central concept for psychology. We are characterizing systems of knowledge, properly so called, not just what are called internal representations. It's the way psychologists, internal representations, data structures, that's the way I'm saying no, we should use the concept of knowledge explicitly. The study of our conjectures about remote history or deep space may not be a study of systems of knowledge, given our ignorance in these areas, but we're not similarly ignorant about what is grammatical or logical or triangular or morally right. The output of the abstract rule-governed generative schematism is knowledge in the most straightforward sense in these cases. It will be useful to have a short label for the schematism I am describing, so let us call it the forms and norms schematism. Then we can express the next feature by saying that the forms and norms schematism is doubly universal. First, it's universal across human beings. Everyone is equipped with it, short of devastating brain pathology. Second, it is universal across a variety of human competences, being shared by at least the four competences that I'm describing. It's doubtful that it is possessed by other species, except perhaps in a very rudimentary form, and it may not be shared by all human psychological capacities, say artistic, especially those inherited during evolution from earlier types of minds. And of course some aspects of our brain is of course inherited from earlier types of mind, such as, for instance, those ancestral fish that led ultimately to us. I mean, parts of our brain and mind are inherited from ancestral fish, and they don't seem to have this structure. Basic sensory motor skills and innate reflexes don't have this abstract structure, or say, another example, different degrees of desire. That's not the same. It isn't it, so again, a more primitive part of the mind in evolutionary terms. It's an interesting question whether our musical ability is also a forms and norms system. Music theory makes it seem so. It's quite abstract and quite combinatorial. But mere receptivity to melody seems too primitive to be explained in that way, or rhythm. It does seem that what is most distinctive of the human mind centrally involves a full-blown forms and norms structure. That is something which is generative, segmental, rule-governed, evaluative, abstract, and cognitive. Next point. Our language faculty appears to incorporate both a conscious and an unconscious component. We're conscious of sentences as grammatical, and we can articulate a good deal about the rules of grammar, but it also seems true that the competence includes an unconscious level, which is why we find it hard to formulate a universal grammar. Otherwise, Chomsky could have completed the project just by introspecting. Much the same seems to hold of the other three competences. We reason logically not by consciously formulating the laws of logic, but by having an implicit grasp of them. It took Aristotle and Frege to bring these implicitly grasped laws to explicit awareness. Our understanding of geometry is largely implicit until we start studying the subject in school. Recall, of course, Socrates and the slave boy in the Meno. And much of morality is not consciously formulated, but instinctively acted upon. Moral philosophers are trying to, in one view, make explicit what's implicit. So we can say that the forms and norm schematism has both a conscious and an unconscious representation in the mind. Perhaps the underlying abstract structure once had a purely unconscious representation, but once it became exploited by more specific competences, its character became more conscious to us, though of course it still remains largely unconscious. It's certainly true that we do not, in the ordinary course of life, experience ourselves as engaging in abstract operations with the character that I have described. Instead, the schematism just whirs away inside us, quietly going about its work, and not aware of all the rules that enable us to speak grammatically. Chomsky has long urged that the structures of universal human grammar are innate. What about the other three areas? Without going into the matter in detail, it seems safe to assume that much the same is true of them. Our logical faculty is an innate component of the human mind, as is our geometrical faculty, and evidence is accumulating that moral psychology also has an innate basis, and a lot of work by psychologists on that recently. If the underlying forms and norms structure is itself innate, which seems overwhelmingly likely, then it will not be surprising if the faculties it grounds are also innate. These areas of knowledge, remember that, we're using that word seriously, are not like our knowledge of history or geography or what is fashionable this season. All these are clearly acquired, but the four competences have a strong claim to innateness for reasons that are now well appreciated. This dovetails with the previous point, since what is innate is likely to be unconscious. The schematism is specified in our DNA and grows in the brain during the course of maturation, only becoming conscious along the edges, so to speak. Again, we see a commonality that confirms the idea that we are here dealing with a psychologically real internal structure, hardwired and universal. I have now enumerated, briefly and dogmatically, the common features that I see as holding over the four competences I am considering. And I want to articulate further what the internal character of the forms and norms schematism is, as well as point to how adopting this perspective alters the way one sees human psychology. The general character of the schematism will be familiar from work done by philosophers, psychologists, and linguists over the last several decades, variously formulated and with varying emphases. I have merely brought these ideas together while imparting my own spin and, I suppose, going for a kind of ambitious overview which people have been probably rightly reluctant to venture. A useful metaphor is that of a network. The elements of a network exist in relation to other elements of the network, united by linking relations. Thus we have the conception of language as consisting of a vast network of signs that link with each other in various ways and swimming into proximity with each other to form phrases and sentences according to fixed rules. In logic, we think of propositions laid out in logical space, linked by logical relations, such as entailment or inconsistency, with rules about what propositions can be inferred from what. Our psychological structure as logicians, people who reason, has to mirror this logical structure in some way so that we can move around it cognitively. In geometry, the metaphor of a space becomes literal, of course, since geometrical forms are conceived as regions of space, carved out in a particular way. Figures can be conjoined with other figures or laid over them, fitting or not fitting. The spatial world looks like a huge mosaic of geometrical figures, regular and irregular. Hence Plato's doctrine that the essence of the material world is geometry, which of course he inherited from Pythagoras. And social groupings are another kind of network, patterns of connections between people, linkages, aggregations into larger groups, groupings, hierarchies, and collectivities. Each person has a place in this social mosaic, and what we are depends partly on our social role. Compare the idea of semantic roles, social role and semantic role. I'm saying that psychologically these are not unrelated ideas. It's all a matter of systems of discrete elements that combine and recombine according to rules, generating endless new wholes ad infinitum, with a heavy dose of normativity, this one good, that one bad. Accordingly, we need in the mind representations for the basic units, representations for rules of permissible combination, and a device to evaluate the outcomes. The mind needs to be able to segment and amalgamate, and it needs the idea of the point of this mental work. The basic form of a mental operation is thus the following: segment, amalgamate, and evaluate. SAE. The human mind is, among other things, an SAE device. I think that the first two parts of SAE have been well recognized, and the mind must be able to analyze and synthesize, to break down and build up. It cannot build up unless it is first broken down, for it needs segmented elements as the building blocks of constructive operations. If there were no words in sentences, we would have to invent them. Given that we want to have sentences because we use them to communicate, and given that we are finite beings, we had better find a way to analyze sentences into finitely many constituent and recombinable parts. Similarly with the visible world, we need a finite stock of visual primitives if we are to make sense of the huge variety of visual scenes that the world can present. Perceptible properties, basically. We also need something like fixed persons to make sense of social life. We need the idea of the same person being a member of many groups or moving from one group to another. That is, we need the idea of an atom, I don't mean in physics, but if we are to have the idea of a molecule in the most general sense. And where would we be without the notion of determinate shapes and sizes and combinations thereof? But once we have the elements neatly segmented, we also need rules to combine them. We must be able to synthesize according to the rules. Thus we arrive at the idea of the mind as a machine for analysis and synthesis that incorporates rules. This is all pretty orthodox today. Of course, this was thought to be radical and controversial even as late as the early 70s, late 60s, when Chomsky started to develop this kind of perspective. But where is evaluation in all this? This is where what I talked about as the paradigm shifters is the most likely to be detected. Where is evaluation in all this, as I say, now quite well recognized position about what the mind is? It tends not to get mentioned. So I want to carve out the rightful place of evaluation in the SAE model. I want to give it its due. And my first point is simply that the mind is also a normative machine. It evaluates things. Sometimes this is acknowledged but then scanted. The normative dimension is regarded as essentially epiphenomenal. Yes, we engage in evaluations of sentences, arguments, drawn shapes, and social actions, but none of this evaluation makes any difference to anything, so it may be said. For how can values influence facts? How can the geometrical rightness of a sentence, how can the grammatical rightness of a sentence play any real role in what we do with it? This is no more possible than moral values playing a causal role in the world. And here we reach the nub. Mental causation cannot be, it is thought anyway, influenced by values. How can values play a causal role in the real world? So if the mind is indeed steeped in values, as I suggested, then this must be epiphenomenal and hence hardly worth mentioning. The causation must be ordinary mechanical causation, of the same kind that we find in the purely physical world. But then there cannot be any such thing as evaluative causation. I think this is a view very commonly adopted, sometimes explicitly, mostly implicitly. What should we say about this line of thought? First, there is confusion in it. The claim is not, at least not initially, that values themselves figure in mental causation, but rather the judgments of value do. It isn't that we produce a grammatical sentence because of its having the value of being grammatically right. We do so because we take it to be grammatically right. Compare. I refrain from stealing something, not because it is wrong to steal, but because I deem it wrong to steal. But these normative attitudes are not themselves values, they are psychological facts. So why can't our attitudes towards values causally influence our actions and our mental operations? Why did I go into a particular restaurant? Because I believed they served good food there, and I wanted good food. Not, of course, as a result of the goodness of the food considered independently of what I believe and desire. I wouldn't have gone there if I didn't have any beliefs about the goodness of the food. The goodness of the food didn't magically reach out to me and make me go in there, obviously. This seems no more problematic than acting on any other kind of belief or desire. So there's nothing metaphysically to prevent us from crediting the mind with a host of evaluative attitudes that influence the way it works. We could even postulate an unconscious grammar evaluator that issues verdicts on strings of words put together by our grammar module, determining which sentences will actually get uttered. It says things like, this one good, or that one bad, evaluating potential strings and producing some kind of censorship on what actually makes it to the point of being uttered. The judgments it makes could have causal powers in respect of what sentences get uttered, and the same could be said for our logical faculty. It issues normative verdicts on arguments in process and can facilitate or halt that process. At any rate, there's no argument derived from the metaphysics of causation to prevent such a hypothesis. Psychological causation by attitudes with evaluative contents seems no more problematic than other sorts of psychological causation. It is true that some theorists are allergic to the use of evaluative notions in scientific theories, but their objection cannot stem from considerations about causation. And it's surely very obvious that human beings are deeply evaluative creatures. They are always going on about right and wrong, perfection and imperfection, praise and blame. This rejoinder is fine so far as it goes. I don't think it goes quite far enough. For I think that the objective rightness involved is part of the overall psychological story. We can truly say that certain outcomes occurred because of an objective rightness in things. For example, I think it is perfectly true to say that I don't produce the string barking it's sing John car very precisely because that sentence is grammatically defective, bad or wrong grammatically. That's the reason. That's why I don't produce it, because it's grammatically defective. I also think it's true to say that I don't steal things precisely because it is wrong to steal. That is, the fact that it is wrong to steal is why I don't steal. There are true because statements linking values with psychological facts, as there are true because statements linking physical facts with psychological facts and statements, say, of perception, physical stimulus and so on. And I think this is an important point about human psychology. It is doubtful that most animals can be made subject to such value-mind statements. They don't do things because of values. So I want to bring values into psychology proper, this is humanistic psychology, as part of the SAE package. In order to explore this question fully, I would need to go into the entire metaphysics of causation, which I do not propose to do here. I will say simply that the mechanical model of causation has long been obsolete, even in physics. Gravity, as I never tire of saying, is not a kind of mechanical contact causation, because Newton's theory is not a case of mechanism. I would favour a more Aristotelian approach to causation, in which causation is made correlative with why questions and is closely linked to explanation. So while it is true that values cannot literally make physical contact with minds, the two cannot touch, they may yet figure in answers to why questions. If we ask why I don't produce nonsense sentences like the one I cited, then the answer is that they are patently ungrammatical and nonsensical. It is because of this that I don't utter them. It then seems to me an entirely verbal question whether we should speak of this as causation. What matters is that it tells us why things happen. We can have perfectly true and informative because statements of the kind in question. Indeed, there are true general statements of this type, as in, for instance, normal speakers don't utter ungrammatical sentences just because they are ungrammatical. In the same way, we can say people don't steal simply because stealing is wrong. The wrongness of stealing explains why people believe it is wrong to steal, and this explains their non-stealing actions. Truth explains belief, which is not, of course, to deny that other factors can come into play in the explanation of belief. This strikes me as simple common sense, and it's important to acknowledge that what happens in people's minds can have this kind of explanation. Thus, a comprehensive psychology will include values as part of the explanatory framework. Put it differently, the human mind is sensitive to values, unlike most other terrestrial minds. We think in terms of values, and values are part of the explanation of our actions and our mental processes. To bleach value out of the study of mind is to miss this important fact, producing a misleading model of how things work. Orthodox computationalism is guilty of this. In a slogan, the mind crunches values as well as symbols. Let me emphasize how modest this claim really is, because it will sound to many philosophers an outrageous statement, but I want to say it's really not outrageous. I'm reminded here of Louise's talk about aesthetic properties, when she was really stating common sense and knocking down arguments that philosophers have given. It's a very common sense position. It says no more than that we are aware of values because of their existence, and that this awareness affects what we do. Thus we are aware that it is good for sentences to be grammatical or for arguments to be valid, and this awareness affects our actions. This is why we put together only grammatical strings and respect valid inferences and keep our promises. Psychology therefore needs to build values into its conceptual framework simply because the human mind is a value-sensitive device. If I put it that way, it's a slightly mechanistic way to put it, but sorry. Unlike the merely physical world or the botanical world or most of the animal world, it is also, of course, as I've been saying, a generative, segmental and rule-governed device. These are all just facts about the kind of thing it is. Each part of SAE must be fully and robustly acknowledged, including this evaluative part. Further questions arise. If this is the essential nature of human cognition, how did it arise in evolution? What pre-adaptations made it possible? How does it develop in the child's mind? Are there other mental faculties with the same general structure? If so, do they derive many of the four we have considered, singly or in combination? So, for example, how does our competence or knowledge of physics or arithmetic or chess, how do they develop? I think it seems very plausible to think that they derive from these earlier, more basic competences. How was the SAE schematism implemented in the brain's neural hardware? This last question is especially difficult because of the general mind-body problem. It raises the question of how the brains and values connect, which is not something that contemporary neuroscience has much to say about. But none of these questions is easy once we take on board the full reality and abstractness of the forms and norms schematism and its place in the mind's overall landscape. This is why I've offered here little more than a sketch. Perhaps we can be comforted by the reflection that these are at least the right questions. Thank you.